A millionaire kicked out his pregnant wife. 20 years later, she came back, but not the woman he remembered. Now let me share with you a challenging real-life story that begins right in the heart of New York City. James Crawford, an influential businessman and real estate tycoon, was accustomed to having the world revolve around him. Born into a family where money was never in short supply and power over others was taken for granted, he had been taught from an early age that the end always justifies the means, and that minor problems, like emotions and attachments, only get in the way of scaling the heights of the business world. He met Emily Clark when she worked as an assistant in one of his Manhattan offices. He was immediately drawn to her genuine smile and modest charm. He was not looking for a serious relationship, more of a brief escape from the harsh realities of endless deals and corporate negotiations. Yet Emily saw in him not only a powerful businessman, but also someone with whom she could hope to build a future if things went well. Of course, she was mistaken, but it's easy to understand why she hoped. He was pleasant, tall, attractive, and, let's be honest, extraordinarily persuasive. They spent a few months together before Emily discovered she was pregnant. Summoning courage, she told James about the baby. At the moment she finally uttered the news, he immediately changed. The friendliness in his face vanished, and the warmth drained away. It was as if she were talking about something trivial that interfered with his grand plans. He didn't yell or rage. He just said, in a cold, distant tone, that he had no desire to ruin his life by becoming a father. His voice was so detached, it sounded like he was negotiating the sale of yet another building. Emily was stunned. She begged him not to make such a rash decision, not to destroy everything so abruptly. But James was unyielding. With a single phone call, he arranged for her immediate dismissal from the company. Her belongings were handed to her at the office door, and the apartment rented under Crawford's name had to be vacated almost that same evening. His decision was swift and brutal. Get out, and don't ever show your face here again. Emily never expected such treatment. She wasn't after money. She had truly loved James and had hoped for a family. Now her world had collapsed. New York, though a city of opportunity, can be unforgiving without money or housing. Emily wandered the streets in desperation, trying to find acquaintances who might lend a hand. The sense of betrayal and hopelessness felt crushing. She contacted a few friends, but either they were in tough situations themselves or had already moved to other states in search of better prospects. Only one friend who lived in Chicago offered her a place to stay, so Emily realized that was her chance to start over. That's how the idea of traveling to a city where she at least knew someone willing to help came about. Before leaving, Emily tried once more to speak with James, only to be politely but firmly refused by his secretary. She could have sued for child support or tried to hold him accountable publicly, but Emily didn't want a legal battle or a scandal. Deep down, she still hoped he would come to his senses. Yet the reality proved otherwise. Day by day, she realized no help from Crawford would be forthcoming. With the last of her savings, she bought a bus ticket, packed her meager possessions, and left New York at dawn. Outside the window, the familiar skyscrapers flickered by, including, somewhere among them, the offices of her former lover. Emily forced herself not to cry, still clinging to a tiny spark of hope. She had no idea what lay ahead in Chicago, but one thing was certain. She was now responsible not only for herself but also for the baby growing inside her. Unbeknownst to her, she was about to face grueling challenges. Yet in that moment of departure, a core strength awakened within her. She would not let cruel circumstances destroy her or her child. Chicago greeted Emily with a chilly wind and gray skyscrapers. The city's atmosphere was different from New York's, less frenzied, but still a sprawling metropolis with its own fast pace and strict rules. Her friend, whose place she planned to stay at, lived on the outskirts in a modest two-room apartment shared by several people. Even so, there was space on the fold-out couch, and Emily was grateful simply to have any roof over her head, even briefly. A couple of days later, she realized that she wouldn't survive long without a job. Her bank account was almost empty. Some friends of her friend helped her find a position as a waitress at a small cafe. It proved exhausting. Back pain, constant fatigue, and demanding or unfriendly customers pushed her to her limits. Sometimes the tips were decent, but other times people paid only the bare minimum. The management had little sympathy for her condition. She was still expected to work 10 to 12-hour shifts on her feet. Yet Emily held on. She knew that in her condition, any job was a blessing. Tensions also grew at the apartment. It was cramped, there was no privacy, and she longed for quiet and solitude. The other roommates eyed her warily, wondering what would happen once the baby was born. She recognized she would have to find her own place soon, but there was no way she could pay rent by herself unless she worked non-stop. An almost impossible feat, given her advancing pregnancy and the physical toll it took. Still, she managed to persevere. During the day, she carried trays back and forth. In the evenings, she scoured ads for cheap rooms around Chicago. Now and then, she'd talk to her family back in the small town she grew up in, but they had limited means and couldn't help financially. She also couldn't bring herself to reveal the full extent of her troubles. It hurt too much to admit that the man she had loved had cast her aside so coldly. Ironically, some of the cafe's regular customers noticed her predicament. A pair of college students, frequent visitors for morning coffee, occasionally left her slightly bigger tips than normal. One regular suggested that Emily look into renting a room from a friend of hers. It was a safe neighborhood and not too expensive by city standards. Piece by piece, she gathered small mercies that helped her crawl out of the stifling apartment where she felt like a perpetual burden. Months passed. Emily lined up a second part-time job at a local college library. She shelved books for a modest wage, hardly lucrative, but far calmer than the cafe. Sometimes she was even allowed a short break when her back pain flared up. Inch by inch, she was inching closer to having enough to leave her friend's overcrowded place. The hardest part was not the physical demands, but the memory of betrayal that haunted her at night. She recalled James's confident gaze, his flattering words, their nighttime strolls through Central Park. She often wondered if it had all been an illusion. The recollections made her want to sob into her pillow, but she kept telling herself she had more urgent responsibilities now. She would soon become a mother, and she had to be strong for the tiny life growing inside her. Tears wouldn't help. Only determination could. Around her 9th month of pregnancy, just when Emily finally managed to move into a tiny studio apartment, she was suddenly gripped by labor pains one late evening. She had just returned from her part-time library shift, intending to go to bed. But the pain grew unbearable. Panicking, she called an ambulance. The stress and her weakened physical state complicated the birth, but the doctors were skilled, and before long, Daniel came into the world. He was a robust, healthy baby, wailing loudly as though announcing himself to the universe. Emily, overwhelmed by joy and fear simultaneously, cradled her newborn son, feeling an immediate, boundless love bloom within her. This was the turning point, marking her truly new life. Every decision, every action from now on revolved around Daniel. After she was discharged from the hospital, Emily faced a fresh wave of challenges: pediatric appointments, unexpected expenses, endless diaper changes, sleep deprivation. She was constantly worried about finding money for basic necessities: formula, clothes, utility bills. Imagine, just a year earlier, She had shared a view of Manhattan's nighttime skyline with James from his luxurious penthouse, and now she found herself poring over simplified childcare manuals, determined not to make a single mistake. Despite these hardships, caring for Daniel brought her immense joy. She worked whenever she could, taking on freelance writing for an online agency late into the night once Daniel was asleep. Many times she felt she had no energy left, but then she would look at her baby boy's smile and realize she'd do anything to provide for him. Time went on, and Daniel grew. His first steps, first words, every tiny milestone meant more to Emily than any sum of money or career achievement. And yet memories of James would resurface, especially when she considered that her child was growing up without a father. Occasionally, she pondered taking legal action for child support, but recalling the coldness with which James had discarded her always stopped her in her tracks. She'd rather raise her child alone than relive that humiliation. She learned not to react when acquaintances asked hurtful questions. "Where's his father? Why are you on your own?" She had no time to think of such judgments while she scrambled to pay the bills and replace Daniel's shoes every time he outgrew them. Gradually, though, she found more stable work. First as an administrative assistant at a city hospital, then at a small recruitment agency. She understood the value of hard work and the difficulty of surviving on one's own income, so she never shied away from big tasks. Her perseverance paid off. She saved enough to move to a modest but better neighborhood. Her neighbors there were mostly families, and Daniel could play in the shared courtyard with other kids his age. He made friends easily and was growing up to be kind and considerate. As for Emily, she did her best to answer his questions about his father gently. She told him that his dad lived in another city and was very busy, avoiding the painful truths. She bottled up her own sorrow to protect Daniel from it. Years flew by. Daniel finished high school with good grades and was accepted into the University of Illinois. He intended to study law so he could help people who found themselves in tough situations, perhaps like the one his mother had faced. His classmates had no idea he grew up without a father, and he saw no reason to broadcast it. But deep inside, he felt a growing need to understand what really happened. One day, while looking through old papers, Daniel discovered a photo of Emily standing next to a man outside a Manhattan office. On the back was written, "James and me, Autumn in New York." Daniel recognized the name from the rare times his mother had mentioned it, but he'd never seen James's face so clearly. He was struck by how unjust it was that this man had disappeared from their lives. Anger and curiosity simmered within him. Why had his father abandoned his mother? Why did she still keep the photo? Daniel confronted Emily that night, demanding answers. At first, she tried to sidestep, insisting it was better left alone. But Daniel persisted. He was an adult and had the right to know his history. Finally, Emily could no longer hold back. She told him everything, not sugarcoating any details. It was painful for Daniel to hear, but he did not blame his mother. He'd expected a harsher, more condemning account of James's actions, yet the truth was already heartbreaking enough. He saw how deeply those memories had scarred her. That same night, after Emily fell asleep, Daniel went online to search for his father. It didn't take long. James Crawford's name appeared prominently in business news, magazine features, and lists of the country's wealthiest individuals. Over the 2 decades since he'd abandoned Emily, his corporation had expanded dramatically, and he was repeatedly linked to major deals and court cases, though he always seemed to slip through unscathed. There was no mention of marriage or children in any of his public bios. Driven by the urge to see his father face to face, Daniel decided not to tell Emily, so as not to upset her. He discreetly purchased a plane ticket to New York for a weekend trip. His heart pounded as he approached the skyscraper in the financial district that housed Crawford's corporate offices, now occupying not just one, but two towering buildings. Steeling himself, Daniel introduced himself as Daniel Clark at the reception desk and requested a private meeting with Mr. Crawford. Naturally, the receptionist asked him to wait and then replied that without an appointment, there could be no meeting. When Daniel, with a bitter half-smile, stated, "I'm his son," the receptionist's eyes flickered with surprise. Perhaps this was not the first time someone had claimed a connection, but it was enough to prompt a few phone calls. 30 tense minutes later, Daniel was ushered into a spacious office with floor-to-ceiling windows. Behind a massive desk sat a distinguished-looking man in an impeccable suit, older but still exuding energy. His gray eyes showed nothing but guarded boredom at first, as though trying to figure out who had walked in. "My name is Daniel Clark," the young man said, his voice trembling slightly despite trying to sound confident. "I'm your son." James's eyes flinched momentarily, but his face remained impassive. It seemed as though he wasn't terribly surprised. Perhaps he had anticipated the possibility that someone from his past might appear one day. After a pause, he gestured for Daniel to sit. The silence in the office was palpable. Daniel demanded to know why his father had abandoned his mother. His voice was sharp, laden with reproach. James listened with folded arms, occasionally murmuring dismissively, "It's my life. I have no regrets," which only fueled Daniel's anger. He had come hoping for some glimmer of remorse or warmth, but was met by a wall of cold detachment. Finally, Daniel jumped up, saying he regretted wasting his time and saw no point in continuing. He felt fooled and hurt, just like his mother years before. Yet a few days later, James reached out first. Daniel's phone rang from an unknown number, and on the other end was his father. This time, James's tone was calmer, though still distant. He invited Daniel to meet again, saying they should talk further. Torn between anger and the lingering hope that something might be salvaged, Daniel agreed. They met at a small restaurant, clearly not one James used for business lunches, perhaps in an effort to avoid attention. Their conversation was more subdued. James spoke about his family background, the way his own parents had raised him to view family as a liability, and how supporting a wife and children was considered an extravagant expense. He tried, in his own way, to justify his past choices. Daniel sensed something like regret in James's voice. That was when James revealed his serious health issues. Doctors had diagnosed a terminal illness, leaving him with little time. How little, he wasn't sure. A swirl of conflicting emotions churned in Daniel. He despised the man who had wronged his mother so deeply, yet he saw a lonely, condemned man before him. Ultimately, confusion and pity fought within him as he returned to Chicago. Back home, Daniel kept quiet about his trip until Emily sensed something was off and pressed him. Realizing he couldn't hide the truth, he told her everything about his meetings with James. Contrary to his expectations, Emily did not lash out in anger. She simply listened in silence, letting out a heavy sigh as though she had long suspected this might happen. It pained her to realize that James had apparently lived his life alone, never learning to genuinely love. And the news of his grave illness added a new layer of sadness. Soon, James called Daniel again, saying his health had deteriorated, and he invited his son to come to New York one more time, this time to his home, the very place where he had once so harshly turned Emily away. From his voice, Daniel sensed the man had accepted that time was running out. Daniel was reluctant, but decided to go, still unsure if anything good could come of it. James's home was stunningly luxurious, but Daniel felt an emptiness in its grand halls. Money and expensive objects could not fill the void of a genuine home. Pale and visibly weaker, James greeted Daniel, Despite his illness, he tried to maintain a dignified air. They spoke again, more candidly than ever before. James finally admitted his guilt, saying that he had nothing left to care about except the son he once rejected. He never directly asked for forgiveness. He didn't seem to know how, but he informed Daniel that he had left his entire fortune and corporate shares to him in his will, and had written several letters, trying to articulate what he could never say aloud. James understood that no amount of money could make up for how he had treated Emily, but he wanted at least to secure his son's future. Daniel stayed in the house for a few days to help care for James, as his condition worsened. He saw that his father was no longer running the corporation day to day. Managers did that. Meanwhile, James grew quieter, as though finally at peace with taking a step toward reconciling with the family he had spurned. When James passed away, Daniel was there. It happened early one morning, the pain forcing James to lie down. The doctors were powerless to help. With his last shred of strength, James met his son's gaze and whispered his gratitude that Daniel had come. His words were faint, barely audible, but Daniel heard them. Looking at his father, he realized how afraid and regretful this once mighty man was at the end. Deep inside, Daniel realized he had been ready to forgive for some time. But it was in this final moment, seeing James's vulnerability, that he could truly do so. A week after the funeral, Daniel was in his father's home, sorting through papers, letters, and keys needed for settling the estate. It turned out James had indeed left him a massive fortune and a significant interest in the corporation. But for Daniel, the letters were far more valuable. In them, James recounted his early years, his fear of appearing weak, and his instinct to flee from any deep emotional ties. The final letter implored Daniel not to repeat his mistakes and to cherish the people around him. Returning to Chicago, Daniel brought with him not just legal documents, but also an awareness of how little money can truly accomplish on its own. Quietly, he told Emily about James's death and showed her a letter James had addressed specifically to her. She read it in silence, tears streaming down her cheeks. The letter contained no direct apology, yet it said that she was the best thing that had ever happened to him, though he had realized it far too late. Emily wept quietly and then said she forgave him. In that moment, she too found some closure to an old wound. With a bit more time, Daniel finally felt relief from the anger he'd carried. He now faced major decisions: how to handle his inheritance, whether to remain in Chicago or move to New York, and whether to step into a role at his father's company. But no matter what lay ahead, he knew that above all else, love and family are what matter most. Without cherishing them, all the money in the world can't save you from loneliness and regret. Thus ends the story of how Emily Clark overcame betrayal to raise a kind-hearted, resilient son, and how James Crawford, who had devoted his life to business and wealth, realized far too late that what truly matters is family. Only in his final days did he try to make amends. And Daniel, at last, laid down his burdens and moved forward, knowing that genuine worth is found in caring for the people we love. That is the true and difficult story that began amid the bright lights of New York City and ended in a quiet confrontation with guilt. There are no extravagant metaphors or magical twists, just people grappling with their weaknesses, mistakes, and hopes for forgiveness. And that's precisely what makes it feel so real. If you want to hear more stories like this, be sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel, where we'll keep exploring how crucial it is to value those close to us and never miss the chance to embrace real happiness.